I want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people whose land we're meeting on today, land that was never ceded, and also the Wurundjeri people whose traditional owners of Naarm, Melbourne, where I live and I'm active. Okay, so we have a problem, a very serious problem. We know that trade unions are fundamental to our ability to protect our wages, our working conditions, our political rights, and so on. But the trade union movement in Australia has been in decline for 40 years. At the moment, just 13% of workers are union members, compared with 40% in 1992 and 51% in 1976. And we're paying the price for that now on many, many fronts. The cost of living crisis, not just a cost of living crisis, but made worse by the leadership of the trade union movement refusing to do anything for years to fight for wages to catch up to rising prices. We've seen the strongest union in the country taken over by the government with no serious resistance from its leadership. We've got hundreds of workers and students threatened and punished for campaigning against a genocide. And now radical new anti-protest laws are certainly in Melbourne and I think other states as well. Again, no resistance from the trade union movement. And of course we have the most right-wing Labor government in generations. So that's the context for the talk and the discussion today. What can we do? How can we rebuild a union movement that fights for living standards and political rights? Now, I'm not going to directly address that question about today. What I'm going to do is look at one of the most inspiring and important periods of struggle in Australian Labor history, which is the struggle through the Great Depression and after to defend living standards and then to rebuild unions that were smashed in the struggles that began the Great Depression. And I'm going to focus for about half the talk on the struggle from 1934 to 35 to protect sugarcane workers, sugarcane cutters in North Queensland from Weil's disease. Okay, so I'm going to start there. Weil's disease is a virus spread by rats. Cane cutters caught it through small cuts in their skin, which they got when they were handling cane thrash, on which the rats had urinated. During the 1933 cutting season, an epidemic of Weil's disease broke out in the Ingham district. 40 cutters got the disease, 4 died. Now, just to give you a sense of how serious this was, the victims all got fever, muscular pains, intense headache, and depression, that is mental depression. Many became jaundiced. The worst cases included internal hemorrhage and black vomiting. The post-mortems on the ones who died showed hemorrhages of the kidney, lungs, and bowel wall, and the disintegration of the spleen. So, it's not a common cold. The only way to prevent Weil's disease was to burn the cane before cutting it. But that reduced the sugar content in the cane, and hence the value of the crop. The workers had all the institutions of power against them in their demand for the cane to be cut. The cane growers and farmers were opposed to burning the cane. The sugar mill bosses were absolutely hostile to the idea. The industry at the time was a monopoly controlled by one company, CSR, Colonial Sugar Refinery, and all 3 words were important in that name. The only union for the sugar workers was the Australian Workers' Union, the AWU, and not for nothing was it commonly called Australia's weakest union. It was virtually the only union in rural Queensland. It was hostile to all strikes and run as a dictatorship by the officials based in Brisbane. There's nothing like it anymore in Australia. I think there's probably nothing like it anywhere in the world. It was just the most appalling organisation. It also dominated the Labor Party and Labor Party government, which ruled Queensland for 40 years, from 1915 to 56, with just a two-year break at the beginning of the Depression. So it's a dreadful organisation. When Weil's broke out again in 1934, there hadn't been a union meeting in Ingham for 18 years. So the Communist Party called a meeting over the issue. 12 people turned up. But they persevered. The next week they called a second meeting. 300 to 400 came, and there'd never been a meeting like that in Ingham before. So led by the Communist Party, the meeting called a strike. 1,500 workers went out on strike, demanding the cane be burned. The cops were sent in by the government. They arrested strikers and beat them up. The union bosses from the AWU turned up and called their own meeting of 40 cutters to pass a motion to return to work. The Communist Party responded with a meeting of strikers, and 700 voted to stay out. The party led in setting up rank and file committees in different areas to lead and sustain the strike. And this solidarity forced the arbitration court to sit while the strike continued, something they were adamantly hostile to doing because it admitted that the workers had actually got some power to force something. And they ordered the cane to be burned. Shortly after the victory at Ingham, Wheels disease broke out in Marillion, killing one worker. The leading communist activist at the Marillion mill, Carl King, then led a strike in that district and got an order for that cane to be burned. But in two adjoining districts where Wheels disease had broken out, the court refused to order the burning of the cane. The party then organised meetings in those areas which voted to strike, and the court immediately changed its mind. You can see that they were very evidence-based in their decisions. Now, this is incredibly impressive work, and I want to now go over what I think the two key elements to the success of these activities. And the first was the building of rank and file organisation in the mill. This was done as part of the Communist Party's strategy to build a militant minority movement amongst trade unionists. The broad idea had come from the Communist International after the Russian Revolution. One of its leaders, Lasovsky, spelled it out for the British Communist Party. It would, he said, be disastrous if the party were content to organise its forces only within its own little party nuclei. The aim here must be to create a more numerous opposition trade union movement. Now, in Australia, the Communist Party was small, but it persisted with attempts to build a left-wing movement and launched a militant minority movement in the late 1920s. But at that time, its influence was limited to Sydney and a few mining towns. Then everything changed between 1928 and 1930. First, the bosses launched a wage-cutting offensive against three major groups of workers: wharfies, coal miners, timber cutters. There were three epic struggles and three terrible defeats, largely because of the timidity and paralysis of the union leaders. Now, the militant minority movement had been building in the miners' union, and at the national conference had won a vote for the establishment of pit committees and of rank and file workers. When the miners refused to accept wage cuts in 1929, they were locked out by the bosses at some Hunter Valley mines. The union leadership refused to call out the whole membership, arguing that miners still working could financially support the members who were still locked out. I mean, I don't know if other people have heard this argument before. It's one I've heard 1,000 times from bureaucrats. Alistair Davidson, in his history of the Communist Party, wrote, "In all these disputes, a significant contrast became apparent. While the workers were becoming more militant, their leaders were becoming more defeatist." Now, anger at this ruling class offensive propelled the Labor Party to government in late 1929, but they did nothing to stop the ruling class offensive, and then the Wall Street crash plunged the world into the Great Depression. Government revenues collapsed, so the Labor government cut pensions, scrapped public works projects, and threw hundreds of thousands, literally, out of work. In 1931, the arbitration court cut everyone's wages by 10%. When the Labor government in New South Wales refused to pay interest on loans to British banks to spend the money on public services, it was sacked by the governor in May 1932, in exactly the same kind of sequence as happened with the Whitlam government in 1975. Unemployment went from 10%, bad enough, in mid-1929 to 21% in mid-1930 in 1 year, and peaked at 32% in 1932. In other words, Australia had the worst unemployment in the world, with the sole exception of Germany, and we know what happened there. So while the union leaders curled up their toes and declared nothing could be done, the militant minority movement organised where it could. The government forced unemployed workers to get work for their sustenance, which was basically just rations, and to get them off the streets. So the militant minority movement set out to organise the dole workers. At the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance, to celebrate the heroes of the First World War, the workers there, many of whom, if not all, were actual veterans, like unemployed veterans in poverty. They went out for 8 weeks, right? These are work for dole workers, went out for 8 weeks under the leadership of a rank and file strike committee, and they won the modest pay rise of 50% in the middle of the Great Depression. In August 1932, employers at a Victorian spinning mill announced a 15% wage cut. But at one factory, Yarra Falls, the 800 workers went on strike straight away and forced them to reduce the wage cut to 7.5%. Now, obviously 7.5% wage cut's terrible, but it is somewhat better. Now, the union officials persuaded the workers to go back to work and accept the new proposal. But the minority movement saw the opportunity for wider resistance to the cut and organised within the mills for the coming union meeting. At that meeting, the workers denounced, attacked their officials, and elected 1,000 workers, elected a rank and file committee to be supplemented by committees in each mill and went on strike. But in this case, the officials were able to isolate the strikers, going mill by mill to get workers to accept the compromise, and in the end they were forced back to work. But win or lose, the minority movement offered an alternative to meekly accepting the poverty and unemployment and ruthless management dictatorships at work. And minority movement groups were built in literally hundreds of workplaces and many unions. So back to the sugar workers. In North Queensland, the first militant minority group was established in 1933 at Marillion by Carl King, who was a mill hand. Now, in 1982, when Carl was in retirement and living in a beautiful, beautiful spot on the Georges River in Sydney, is probably worth $10 million now, I was able to interview him. Beres Penrose and I interviewed him. He told me that he started producing a minority movement bulletin which he could only distribute by sneaking into the mill at night and pinning it up. But the idea struck a chord. He soon had a branch of 6, and shortly after that was publishing a bulletin in both English and Italian. The first strike he led was over the demand for soap for the washroom. Soap for the washroom. They went out on strike and won it. And a series of victories over small issues like that built the minority movement at the mill. The minority movement at Marillion didn't confine itself narrowly to workplace issues. When the local Labor Party council decided to evict a widow to sell her house to pay back rates that she owed, they went around, tore down these notices and called a public meeting. The council not only backed down, but was forced to waive the rates for the rest of her life. So within a year, the Communist Party had established minority movement branches in several areas. At Innisfail, the minority movement had about 15 members, met every fortnight. In 1982, I was also able to interview Bluey Bliss, who had joined the minority movement in Innisfail, and told me that it was the role of the movement in the Wheels disease strikes that was the key to building. Because the sugar districts were so dispersed, the minority movement had decided to call a conference in May 1934 to coordinate their work in the far north, and because there'd already been this Wheels disease the previous year. 34 delegates from practically every area in North Queensland. From the start, they were active around every issue. At Inkerman Mill, a strike against breaches of the award. At Tully and South Johnson, strikes against attempts by management to increase working hours. At Home Hill, a strike for a better work agreement. So this was the organising that lay behind the success of the 1934 Wheels disease strike. But there was a second factor, I think, that was crucial to the success of the minority movement in North Queensland: their relentless campaigning against racism and fascism. The AWU supported the White Australia policy and argued that it was for the benefit of members, but of course it really only benefited the shareholders of colonial sugar. In the 1930s, some of the main victims and targets of the White Australia politics were Italians and other migrants from southern Europe. I mean, I've got somewhere in my boxes I've got the Labor Party's 1925 election leaflet, which basically says the government is betraying white Australia by importing Italians and Yugoslavs. That's the Labor Party's campaign for election in 1925. The AWU was absolutely hostile to these migrants. Apologies for the racist quote to follow. In 1925, the paper said the government had, quote, betrayed Australian workers by encouraging Mediterranean scum to overrun the country. And they appealed to the state Labor government to exclude all Southern Europeans from the sugar industry. During strikes in Ayr in 1932 and 33, the officials set out to create racial division, telling cane cutters it was the foreign-born comrades who were responsible for working conditions. That was literally what they said. And the Red Leader, the Militant Minority Movement's newspaper, denounced all this racism, pointing out that, quote, the arbitration court, in one of their customary bursts of fair play, reduced the wages of all sections of workers, British and foreign-born. Alongside this anti-racism, the CP campaigned against fascism. And this was not some remote issue in North Queensland, because there were openly fascist organisations within the Italian community. For their part, the federal government hammered anti-fascist Italians, delayed their naturalisation, raided their clubs, banned their newspapers, and gave their names to the Italian government, the fascist government in Italy, so they could harass their family members. And this was particularly important on the cane fields because there were so many Italian cane cutters. The party's anti-racist and anti-fascist politics and activity opened the door to rapidly building a base among these cane cutters. Okay, so when we look at the successful strike in Ingham, the cane fields were led by these communists, Pat Clancy, some people will know who he turned out to be, Pat Clancy and Mario Cazzolino, along with the Italian anarchist and anti-fascist leader Francesco Carmagnola. But impressive as 1934 was, it was the 1935 Wheels disease strike was the largest and the decisive action. Again, before the cutting season, the minority movement had organised a conference of rank and file sugar workers, and this decided to establish rank and file committees in all the sugar centres and to print a workers' paper in English and Italian. They faced open warfare from the union and the bosses and arbitration, which rescinded its orders to cut cane, to burn cane before cutting. They rescinded it. When the AWU officials refused to challenge this no-burn order, they organised their own strike at the Marillion and Tully mill areas. The strike then spread to Gundy and South Johnson. Throughout the north, the party organised fundraising and kitchens to feed the strikers, many of whom were evicted from company barracks. Wide sections of the community were involved, including many local women, providing support for the strike and so on. Okay, in the end, the police repression, the sacking of militants and dividing of strikers into smaller groups by the officials allowed them to be able to end the strike. The following year, 1936, 10 cases of Wheels disease were reported. The Industrial Court issued an immediate order that all cane would be burned everywhere. This was the victory that had been denied them the previous year, but everyone knew why that order was given. It was because of their relentless industrial action. The influence of the Communist Party in North Queensland surged. It had 360 members in 1935, and the following year, enough money and support to launch their own separate weekly newspaper, Communist Party newspaper. And the only Communist Party member to ever win election to Parliament, Fred Patterson, was elected for the North Queensland seat of Bowen. So, how much time have I got? 19. Oh, I'm at 19. Okay, I really have to wind up very quickly. Okay, I'll probably go a few minutes over, but hopefully not too many. Okay, so I haven't got time to go through. I've left out of this the dark side of the role of the Communist Party. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it to anybody who wants to know. But it's also important to say that one of the greatest strikes led by this kind of minority movement activism was the coal strike at Wonthaggi, which I think was also in 1934. And if anyone wants to know about that, there's a fantastic film that was made about the Wonthaggi strike called Strikebound. So anyone who wants to see what a great strike is like should go and look at that. Okay, I just want to finish up with a few general points on why we need rank and file movements after seeing the role they can play at a time when trade union organising is, in a way, the most difficult. First and foremost, we recognise the central importance of trade unions as the key organisations through which the working class can fight exploitation and oppression. But these are struggles to ameliorate our situation. Without getting rid of the system, every pay rise can be taken back. Every condition, every political right can be torn up, and we have seen that happen, haven't we? We don't just want more effective unions, we want struggles and unions that lay the foundation for revolution. And that includes the building and testing of revolutionary leaderships. Trade unions have two inherent, inescapable weaknesses. The first is that they inherently and necessarily develop a layer of officials who take charge of negotiating with the bosses. This leads the officials to become mediators between the workers and bosses, isolated from the people they represent, balancing between the two great classes of capitalism, and they evolve into a distinct conservative social formation, balancing between workers and bosses, their primary interest preserving union organisation. And this is true whether the people elected to become union leaders have been the most fabulous militants on the job or whether they've been right-wing scumbags from Catholic Action. So most of the time, fighting the bosses also necessarily forces us to campaign against and often openly fight the officials as well. The second problem is that unions are most successful when they recruit all workers in that industry or trade. But that means the membership includes racist, liberal voters, those purely concerned for themselves, as well as socialists and militants and people who are occasional activists. When the officials want to isolate or contain the militants, they rest on this passive right-wing layer within the class. So again, as Trotsky said, the weakness of unions stems from this very important aspect, this very important strong side of unions, the fact that they do embrace the whole class, and that's what we want. And rank and file groups are important to play a role in building and strengthening the militant and radical minority within a workplace, an industry or a union. And so this is the context for us to think about the role of rank and file organisations in our unions. We cannot build the class struggle simply by replacing one set of union officials with another. The entire experience of 200 years of trade unionism is clear on that. Likewise, union democracy is important, but not an end in itself. It is only valuable to the extent that it actually makes it easier for workers to discuss and agree on action to fight the bosses or the state. So in the sugar industry in the 1930s, the Communist Party built the militant minority groups that in some situations organised strike action of unionists, but independent of the direct involvement of the union bureaucracy. In the Wonthaggi coal strike, the militant minority worked with the union to lead small actions that led to the strike and worked with left officials to get the union to back the strike and with other left officials to get support. From the mid-1970s, the International Socialists, an organisation that produced Solidarity, also worked with many other activists to build rank and file groups. So I just want to emphasise that the way we build these groups is very contingent on concrete circumstances shaped by our general perspective of what unions are and the potential. And now with the system in deeper crisis, we urgently need to use all these experiences to help us build a new militant and radical minority. Thanks. Yeah, so much to talk about. First of all, thanks for incredibly rich discussion. And I think the thing that comes out of the discussion is the gulf between the episode I talked about and the reality facing comrades today. Right now, in a way, that gulf is deliberate. Right. We do not expect to be producing a militant minority movement on the scale I talked about in the next 12 months, right? Just to clear that up. But I think that it's important to understand that that's what we're aiming at, right? I mean, we don't become political activists just to think, oh, can we get an extra, $2 an hour, right? That's not what we're doing here. We want to smash the system. And so we want to have a sense of where we can take it. And we also, I think, have to understand that we are entering a situation of crisis where the kind of problems people have got now are going to get a lot more serious quite quickly. So it's not going to be a question of business as usual, I think, in the next 2 years, and that's something we have to face up to. So the first thing I want to say about that, and all the questions, how do we get a rank and file movement or minority movement? I think the first thing is that there are a handful of situations where we can play some kind of role in some kind of rank and file movement. Sydney Uni is an example. Teachers in Melbourne, a handful of examples that we can do that at the moment, right? And those examples are incredibly important. We all have to learn from them. But that's not where we start. We start with what you can do on the job. And I think the key conception that we need to get into our heads is the one of leadership. Because leadership is not what union officials do. Leadership is finding a way to mobilise the people who you work with, right? And that was the importance of the story from Carl King about having a strike over soap, right? Now, what's the link between soap and a revolution? Well, actually, there is a very strong link, right? It's about the dignity of workers, the need of workers, fighting for what you need. But it's starting off finding out, well, what is it that's going to connect with the people I work with, right? And to be honest, that is extremely contingent, right? I can't stand here and tell you what it is, right? You've got to find it. Leadership's about kicking the fucking door down. That's what it's about. It's not about getting a formula, going to work and reading the script. It's finding out what will do it, right? And that's what the really great militants and the great activists can do. I mean, I'm from Melbourne, and at Melbourne Uni, we've had a comrade come from Sydney, Casey, who has led the most brilliant activism on campus, right? And Casey didn't do it by reading some script about Palestine, right? Leadership's about finding the way to take that first step. And it's a combination of two things. One is the grievances on the job, and then the second thing is the idea that collective action can win, right? Because everyone's intimidated. Everyone's scared. The laws, the repression over Palestine, and so on. Everyone's scared, right? It's finding that way to do it. And so it could be as simple as something like a petition asking our union to support the train drivers' strike, right? Not in a, like I'm talking about in a factory or an office. You can do this. It's not your union, but the idea that the strike matters. I'm just throwing this up as the kind of way to start thinking about it. So there's no excuses. We've got to be concretely thinking about what can be done in every workplace. And then when you become the person who does things, organises, you get some morale among your members, then, they can become activists even if there's nothing happening in their union, just in supporting other strikes, getting politically active, but also finding other workplaces where there's grievances and so on. Some places it's easier, other places it's harder. But every lesson you learn about mobilising the people at work, however tiny your achievements, will be very, very important when suddenly there's sackings in the industry, where there's some other repression in the industry, where the workers who have been indifferent suddenly realise we've got to do something, and that's why that's why I mentioned all the little things the minority movement did before they were able to take the great leap forward with the Wheels disease strikes. I just want to finally take up what Tommy said about, collisions with union officials. I think we need to be absolutely clear that this is not a moral question. It is not a question that your officials are bad people, right? It's a question of their job makes them into conservatives, right? In the middle of the Russian Revolution, right, 1917, every comrade will study the Russian Revolution. What I didn't study about the Russian Revolution until quite late is the trade union organising that went on in the middle of the Russian Revolution in 1917, when there's a war going on, millions are being slaughtered, incredible repression. There's trade union organising. recruiting members to unions and going on strike in the middle of 1917, right? And electing new trade union officials who were Bolsheviks. And what happens when the Bolsheviks, right? We're not talking about solidarity in Australia. We're talking about this hardened organisation. Their members become trade union leaders. What happens? They become conservative, right? They become conservative. It's not a question of the people. Pat Clancy, I mentioned, became one of the most ruthless dictatorial union bosses in the building industry we've had, right? He was a monster in his own way, right? But he starts off as this phenomenal activist in the sugar fields. And there's any number of other examples. It's a question of understanding. It is not a question of being personally hostile to union leaders, but understanding no matter how good your union leaders have been and occasionally are, their whole position drives them to be conservative, and the members have to be organised to act independently of them when they act in that way, right? This is a political necessity, and if we don't do it, we hand the membership over not to the union officials, but to the bosses. That's what we do if we don't do this. And I mean, there's many, many situations where good activists have seen the issue as getting good officials up, getting rid of right-wing scumbags from the National Civic Council, and all these good activists become the next layer of conservative officials. So it's very important that I know the point you're making about, just railing off at the officials. But let's be clear, railing off at the officials is a sign of weakness, but it's also a sign of anger. And that anger has to be organised in a constructive way, and the people who rail off at the officials not just dismissed as anti-union, unless of course they are. Okay, so I should just sum up. I'm sorry, I've gone on far too long. I think one of the most important things in Tony Cliff's book on Lenin, Building the Party, is the chapter where he talks about leadership being an art. Leadership being an art, right? What every comrade has to learn or try to learn is the art of leadership, the art of finding the way to organise and take the struggle forward. And that's why a political organisation like Solidarity is so central. It's so central because we want to be the school of learning to lead, right? Not highfalutin concepts of leadership, but the bread and butter, down-to-earth business of leadership on the job in whatever context you've got. And recognising and seeing when people are able to do that and learning from them. And that's why everyone who wants to fight for a better world and fight for decent unions and fight for unions to be more than just unions should be joining us.